Hi, I'm Sheth. I'll be going through homework assignment 4 of CSE2 spring semester of 2014. Okay, so let's begin with the first program. We need to ask the user to enter the last two digits of their Lehigh ID, and based on that we can determine whether they're a senior, a junior, a sophomore, a first-year student, or a grad student. Now, one way of approaching this would be to write many if statements. So if the user enters 14, they would be a senior. If they enter 15, they would be a junior. But in this video tutorial, I'll teach you a different way of approaching this problem through the switch statement. Okay, so I'm on Cloud 9 where I'll be writing the program. I have some basic code written out already. I'm importing the scanner class. Later on, we'll ask the user to enter input. Under that, I've defined a class and a main method. I also created the scanner object and assigned it to a reference variable, which I'm calling it input. Okay, so in case you don't know how to write this program, let's just briefly outline it. The first thing we want to do is that we want to ask the user for an input. Okay, so once they enter an input, we need to make sure that the input is a valid integer. Because remember, they can enter strings, they can enter negative numbers. We need to make sure that it falls in the range between 0 and 17. And once we do that, we need to determine what class the user is in depending on the input they enter. And that's basically the outline of the program we'll be writing now. Okay, so the first step of the problem is to ask the user for an input. So let's begin by prompting the user to enter something. So system.out.print enter the last two digits of your Lehigh ID. Now, remember, this will just print it out. It won't ask the user to enter anything yet. And when the user does enter something, we want to make sure that they enter an integer, because if they enter a string, it can result in a runtime error. We can achieve this by writing if, and if they do not, this is why we're using the not operator, because if they do not enter an integer, so if the input, which is what I call my scanner variable, does not have a next int, if that returns false, then we can output an error message, println you did not enter an integer. And then at this point, we can also terminate the program because it's unnecessary for it to continue running. So system.exit 0, and the 0 just indicates that the program terminated on purpose. Assume that the user has entered an actual integer. And once they've entered an integer, we should save that to a variable. I'll call it usernum, and I'll make it equal to what the user inputted. One more thing we need to check about the number that the user enters is that it needs to fall within the range of 0 and 17. So just like we did before, if the user enters a number outside of the range 0 or 17, we should just terminate the program. Okay, so now at this point, we've determined that the input is valid. We can check that off the list. And the next step is to determine what class the user is in. Typically what we would do is that we would use an if statement, and we would probably write if the user num is equal to 14, then we know that they're a senior. If the user num is 15, then we know they're a junior. So you would write out a huge list of if statements. A more efficient way of writing that out is through the switch statement. And the way you write it out is that you write switch and then the variable you want to target. So in this case, usernum, and that's what the user inputted. So if the last two digits of their Lehigh ID are 14, and the way we make usernum equals 14, pretending if it was an if statement, is that we do case 14. So when usernum is 14, we run the following code. System.out.print. We want to print that you are a senior. One important thing about switch statements is that within every case, you need to make sure that you break it, or else the code underneath it will run as well. So, for example, right here I have case 14, so when usernum is 14, this will run. And only this will run because I break it afterwards. So let's continue this. Next we have case 15. If the last two digits is 15, we want to print out that you are a junior. And once again, we need to break it. And in order to understand exactly what breaking does is that right here, if we didn't have a break, it would print out this statement and it would print out this statement as well. It would print out both that they're a senior and that they're a junior, and we only want to print out one. Okay, so using the same logic, I added cases 16 and 17, but one thing we're missing is that if the user num is anywhere between 0 and 13. An easy way to write this out, of course, if we were using an if statement, is that if the user is none of these, then it prints out that they're a graduate student because the number would fall between 0 and 13. So for a switch statement, we don't write else. Instead of else, we write default. So by default, the number will be from 0 to 13 because it hasn't met any of the conditions above. So we will print out that you are a graduate student. Our code is complete. Okay, so let's just make sure that the program compiles correctly. Yep, and let's run it. So let's enter a negative number, which would give us an error. Yep, let's enter a number out of bounds. That also gives us an error. And then let's enter 17, which should give us a first-year student. A number between 0 and 13 gives us grad, and just check out one more. 14 would be a senior, and the program works. Now for our second program, we will prompt the user to enter a month in the form of an integer. So they will enter a number anywhere from 1 through 12, and based on the month they enter, we will output the season that the month falls under. So just like in program number 1, I'll show you how to approach this using a switch statement. Okay, so let's jump right into it. I have the basic classes and methods already written out. So how will we solve this problem? The first thing that we have to do, of course, similar to the last one, is that we need to ask the user, we need to prompt them to enter a month. To enter a month, right? And the month they enter is going to be a number anywhere from 1 through 12. Next, we need to make sure that the input is an int and between the range of 1 through 12. Finally, once we know that it's an integer within the right range, we need to output what season that the month falls under. The same thing we did with the last program we're going to do here. We're going to ask the user to enter a number. This time it's going to be a month. So enter the number of a month. Of course, this won't prompt them to enter anything yet. We're just printing it out. So next, we want to make the user enter something. Because we just displayed enter the number of a month here, we want to make the user enter something, and whatever they enter, we need to make sure that it's an integer. Because if it's not an integer, if it's another data type, the program can result in a runtime error. The way we could do this is the same thing we did last time. If has next int returns false, then we know that we can end the program at that point. So if the input and then has next int, if it returns false because the data type doesn't match an int, then we can output an error message. You did not enter an integer. And also we can exit the program because it's unnecessary for it to continue running. Because we know that the user must have an integer in order for the code to continue, it's safe to assign what the user inputted into a variable. I'll call mine usernum just so I keep it consistent with last time. So to prevent a long sequence of if statements, we're going to write a switch statement. And we begin by writing switch, and then the variable we want to focus on, which would be usernum, and then we put in curly braces. And before we begin writing, it's important to notice that the months January through March are going to be considered winter. So that if the user enters anything from 1 to 3, we need to output that the month falls under the season winter. And then the same goes with April, any month from April to June. They're all going to be considered spring. Months from July to September will be part of the summer. And then finally, October to December is going to be fall. So here's a tricky part of the problem that you might get stumped on. How do you make the months January to March output the same thing? Of course, one way of going about it is to write case 1 and then output that the month you entered is from winter, case 2, the month you entered is from winter, and then case 3, the month you entered falls under winter. Now, while that does work, it's inefficient. We can utilize the fall through feature of them. Because right here I write case 1, but I don't write break, it's going to continue running and it's going to continue following directions as if it were also case 2. And I also won't have a break here, so now I have cases 1, 2, and 3, which will all follow the same instructions. And I will do system.out.println, your month is in the season winter. So right here what I'm doing is that I'm making cases 1, 2, and 3 all output the same thing because I don't use breaks anywhere above them. And then in the end, I'll just break it on case 3 because I don't want cases 3 to start conflicting with cases 4 because they fall under a different category. So I went on and I added all the other remaining cases for the other months all the way up to December. But if we recall, we need to make sure that the input, what the user enters, it needs to be between 1 through 12. And we only have cases up for 1 through 12. So if the user enters a number such as 13 or any negative number, we need to make sure that we output an error message. So by default, we can have a default case this time. We don't always need to have a default case, so we will write system.out.print you entered an integer outside the range 1 through 12. And then we can just break it. And this will be the end of our switch statement, and we're done with the program. I'll just run it right now just to see if we have any compiler errors. Okay, so to fix this problem, what it's telling me is that class year is not the same thing as my file name, which is understandable because I didn't update the month in the last program I wrote. So now this should work out. And then I'll run the program. So let's enter January, so 1, and it's in the winter, that's correct. And we can also enter 2, and it's going to output the same thing as 1. Okay, and let's pretend we enter a number that isn't an integer, and it gives us an error. And there's one more negative to see what would happen. And that's outside of the range. If I want to make it look better, I can just add println. Alright, so let's go on to program number 3. It's asking us that we need to prompt the user to input the first 4 digits of their credit card number, and based on that we can try to determine who issued their card. For example, if the first 4 digits are 6011, then the issuer is Discover. However, although they input the first 4 digits, for certain card issuers, such as MasterCard, we only need to look at the first 2 digits to identify that the card issuer is MasterCard. And this is what makes the problem tricky, is because for some issuers we need to look at all 4 digits, while for others we only need to look at 2. And the question is, how exactly do we single out the first 2 digits? One way to do this is by converting the user input into a string, and then based on that we can locate the first and second characters. However, another way of doing this is that we can manipulate the numbers they give us. We can divide them by 100 and do other types of manipulations which don't require us to convert to a string. So both problem number 3 and problem number 4 require certain specific digits to be extracted. So for this problem, for problem number 3, I'll teach you the approach of solving this by converting to string, and then for program number 4, I'll teach this method to you by just keeping them as an integer. So before we begin programming, I want to make sure you understand how exactly we're going to target the first 2 digits that the user inputs. So let's say the user inputs the number 1, 2, 3, 4. we're going to store that as a string. And the reason we use strings is because they have indexes which we can target. So for example, right here, the beginning of the string begins with index 0. Then it's index 1, 2, 3, and so on. So now the question is, how do we target the specific index? And the way we do this is that we use Java's .char@at method. And inside the parentheses, we put in the index that we want. In this case, we want the first number, so we put index 0. We also want the char at index 1, which is going to return 2. And it's important to realize that it returns a char. It looks at the string and it returns a char. So right here, it's going to return 1, and then right here, it's going to return 2. So now that we know how to approach the problem, it's going to be a lot easier to solve. Let's start off with system.out.print, and we'll ask the user, enter the first 4 digits of your credit card. And then, because we don't have to check whether the input is a double or an integer, we can save the user's response into a string. I'll call it cardNum equals input.next. So I'm storing the user's input into a variable. Next, because we know what the user inputted and we want to target the first 2 digits, as previously stated, the char@at method returns a char, not a string. So when we create a variable for these 2 digits, we need to make sure that their data type is a char. So char digit 1 equals cardNum, which is what the user inputted, dot char at 0. Then we'll repeat the same process for digit 2 equals cardNum dot char at 1. And index 1 and index 0 will return the first 2 digits. Finally, we'll finish off by adding one more string, and I'll call it card type, and that's going to be the type of card they have. So it's just going to make it easier to output whether they have a Discover card, a Visa card, a Diners Club, or any other type of card. We need to make sure that the user only inputs 4 digits. If they input any more or any less, the program can't detect who issued the card. Also, because we're working with strings, we can't search over a certain range, such as 1000 to 999. Instead, we need to use the method .length. So in this case, we'll do if cardNum.length. If it returns 4, then we can continue searching and we can try to find out who issued the card. Next, we need to search through all the conditions of each card issuer. So for Discover card, cardNum.equals, so the value of cardNum, of the value of what the user inputted, needs to equal 6011. Notice how I use .equals instead of the double equal sign. Because we're working with strings, it's better to use the .equals method rather than the double equal sign. So now that we know the card type, I'll make my variable card type equal to Discover. Next, I'll write an else if the first digit is 5, and notice how I'm using single quotes here. Because digit 1 is a char, I'm going to use single quotes rather than double quotes. So if the first digit is a 5 and the second digit is a 0, we know it's going to be a MasterCard. So let's write that out. We need to use double and because we're comparing. Both need to be true, and digit 2 equals char 0. Then we know the card type is going to be a MasterCard. So using the same concept I taught to determine who issued the MasterCard, I continued the same process to find out the Diners Club International, and who issued a Visa card using different conditions. Okay, so there are a lot of tricky concepts in the single if statement. Remember, if we're dealing with numbers, use a double equal sign. If we're going to use a data type of string, if we're comparing strings, make sure you use .equals. Also, right here we're working with chars, so use a single quote on them. There are a lot of different concepts here. Okay, so we're almost done, except we're missing one critical step. Let's pretend the user does enter a 4-digit number. However, they enter a random 4-digit number and none of the criteria is met. So if we can't determine the credit card issuer, we need to output an error statement. So if the card type, if that still equals exactly what it equaled when it was initialized, then we know that the credit card wasn't detected. So we'll print out you did not enter a valid credit card number. On the other hand, if it was detected, then we can do system.out.println you have a, and then I'll just use my card type variable because we know the type of card they have, add an other space so we have proper spacing, credit card. And then we're done with the program. I can remove these curly braces just because I have one statement. Also, as you notice here, because I only have one statement inside my else if, I don't need to have curly braces, although it is a good practice, because if you tend to add on extra statements afterwards, you will need the curly braces. And to finish off the third program, let's see how it compiles. Let's find out any errors. Okay, this looks like a typo. And an important thing to realize is that because it's a method, the dot length, we need to have parentheses after it. And now it should compile properly. And when we run it, we can test out some sample numbers. So if we enter 1, 2, 3, 4, I can also test out other numbers, such as numbers that are too long. Also, let's test out a number that matches Discover cards. That works correctly as well. And then perhaps another number as well. And there we have it. The program works perfectly. The fourth program is similar to the third program, as I mentioned earlier. We still work with credit cards, however this time we work with their expiration dates. As you can see, the expiration dates are formatted as 2 months followed by 2 digits of their year. And so let's say, for example, the user enters 0216. We need to interpret that as February of 2016 because the month 02 is February and the year 16 corresponds with 2016. So last time I taught you of how you can target specific characters by having a string and then using the char at method. However, because we're working with integers, we don't have to convert to string all the time. This time, I'm going to teach you another way of how to manipulate the numbers so you can select the first 2 months and then the next 2 digits for the year. So in order to select 1, 2, what we can do is we can divide the number by 100. And when we divide it by 100, we're going to get the answer to be 12.34. Now, because we're working with just integers, because this will be an int, the remaining 0.34 will be truncated, thus giving us exactly what we want, 12. Next, we need a way to target 34. If we do 1, 2, 3, 4, this time we do mod 100, that will give us the remainder. And as you saw here last time, the remainder was 34 out of 100. Thus, 1234 mod 100 results in 34, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so let's begin by outlining this code. Let's begin by asking the user to input 4 digits. We need to make sure the input is an integer. We'll also have to make sure the integer is 4 digits long. Finally, we will have to determine the month of the expiration date. Finally, we can output the month and the year that the card expires. So let's start coding. We're going to print out to the console, print, enter the expiration date of your credit card. Next, just like we did in previous problems, if the input does not have a next int, if that returns false, then the system can print out please enter an integer. Also, at this point, we can exit the program because they didn't enter the proper data type. So if the if statement didn't run, then the user must have entered an integer. So therefore, it's safe to store the user input into a variable. I'll call mine expdate, and I'll make it equal to what the user inputted. What's tricky about this problem, and what stumped me at first, is that sometimes the user may enter only 3 digits. For example, if the month is January and the year is another number, then the user will only enter, or the computer will only detect that the user entered 3 digits because the first 0 will be ignored. However, in other situations, such as December, it will be detected as 4 digits. So we need to write a range that allows both 3 and 4 digit numbers to be accepted. In order to do this, we'll write an if statement. So we'll write if, and the expiration date is less than 100, because less than 100 would mean that the expiration date is 2 digits, which we don't want. Or if the expiration date is greater than 9,999, which would essentially be 5 digits, we don't want that either. And then because it's out of the range, we can print an error message that says your expiration date is not 4 digits. And then also at this point, we can terminate the program. So system.exit 0, because it terminated properly. We don't need the remainder of the code to run. We can continue on by isolating the 2 digits of the month and the 2 digits of the year. Like I said before, because these are integers, we can easily divide by 100 and we can mod it by 100. At this point, we have an expiration date that's going to be between 3 and 4 digits, and it's also going to be an integer and not any other type of data string. So it's about time that we can isolate the first 2 digits of the month and the next 2 digits of the year. And as we outlined before, we can simply do this by doing the expiration date, divide that by 100, and I'll store that into a variable called int month_num. Also, I'll create another int called year_num, and I'll make expiration date mod 100 this time, so I get the digits of the year. And then just to easily output the month that the user gets, I'll just create a new variable called month. Let's go back to the top and take a look at the outline we created. We already completed the first 3 tasks, and then our next task is to determine the month that the card expires. We're going to have to need a case for each and every single month that we have. So if the month is in January, we need our month_num to equal 1. If it's in December, month_num should equal 12. We can accomplish this by a switch statement. So switch, and then we have month_num, because that's what we want to focus on. If the month_num, if the user's card expires on month 1, then our output for our month variable will equal January. So now we know that the card expires in January. And we'll continue this on. So if the variable equals 2, then we can output February. We can go on with all our cases from 1 through 12. Okay, so as you can see, I added all the cases from January through December. If the number doesn't lie anywhere between 1 through 12, then clearly the user has an incorrect expiration date. They entered something incorrectly. So by default, I have the switch statement give an error message. And instead of having a break, I have system.exit, because I just terminate the program if they don't enter the correct year. This prevents us from outputting something incorrectly. Okay, printing out the year_num is also a bit challenging here, because I was just thinking of printing out the number 20 and then the year_num. So let's say the year_num is 43, and then we have the expiration year, 2043. Pretend we have, we print out 20, and then we print out the year which the user enters as 34. However, the problem with this is of just inserting 20 before the year_num is that for some cases, year_num may be less than 10, and if it is less than 10, then the year that the card expires on, 203, is clearly incorrect. So for certain cases, we need to add the number 200 in front of year_num, while in other cases, we only need to add the number 20 in front of the number year_num. We can do this by using an if statement. If the year_num is less than 10, then system.out.println the credit card expiration date is, and then we add the month. Well, let's not forget the parentheses is the month, and then we'll add some more text of 200 plus year num. And this basically is to address anything that I mentioned before. So the year 2001 prints out versus 201. And then if it's greater than 10, else, then we can print out system.out.println the credit card expiration date is, and then the month, and then of the year 20, and then we can just print out the year num, because it's unnecessary to have 200 this time. We have a program that is complete. Let's make sure that it compiles properly. We're going to compile it. And the compiler error says it can't find the symbol. Okay, that's because the variable is incorrect. We'll just add an E, save it, and then run it again. And no more compiler errors. And then we'll just run it. Okay, so we can fix the formatting later, but let's just pretend we use the number 2012, and it's correct, December of 2012. And the program is working properly. We can run it a few more times. Let's say the month doesn't exist, and then we just have a random year there. Okay, the month is invalid. That's good. And then let's just have one more single digit month and a single digit year, and it still works. Let's just fix the formatting, but the program is done. And there we have it. This is the fourth program, and now it works. Alright, finally, and for program number 5, it's asking us to revisit another homework assignment from this semester, but just to conserve time and not repeat what someone else is already making a tutorial on, I won't go in depth on how to write and code homework number 2. However, I will explain the main purpose of this program that we're going to write right now, which is to format decimals to only a certain number of digits. So right here it's asking us to format this long decimal number to only 2 decimal places. So how exactly do we do that? So right here I have all the code for homework assignment number 2 written out, and in the bottom right here I'm printing out the cost of certain goods. As you can see, I've already run the program several times, and I'll run it again to show you how there are a lot of extraneous decimal places which we wouldn't want since we're only dealing with money. So for the average cost per person, we want to format that to only 2 decimal places, and specifically the assignment isn't asking us to round the hundredths, so we just want to truncate any extraneous decimals. The way we can achieve this is by, instead of using println, now we can do printf. And what printf is that it stands for print format. So instead of having plus signs now on the left side, where I have all of the string to be printed out, it's going to also print out the command which will format the variable on the right side. So we can use a comma to separate the left and the right, and I'll just use %.2f. So what this does is that it tells the printf method that we only want the first variable on the right to be formatted to 2 decimal places, to 0.2 floating points. And because we're not printing lines anymore, we want to make sure that we add a new line afterwards, so everything on the next line isn't combined together. So let me just prove this to you. So let's compile the program, and then we'll run it afterwards. There we go. We have it formatted to only 2 decimal places, and there's a new line after it. If we didn't add a new line, then let's see what would happen. So for the total cost, we also want to round that to 2 decimal places, or we only want to see 2 decimal places. So we can do this by splitting the left side and the right side. Then we have a percent, 0.2f once again, because we only want the printf method to use 2 decimal points. And then this should work, and it should combine the last. It should combine total cost with total paid. Hold on, I didn't change it to printf. That's why it's not working. So compile it one more time, and then we'll run it. And see, right here, it's combining total cost with total paid, which is something which we don't want. When we format something, we want everything to be formatted properly. After that, we can also do %n like I did before, or I can show you something you might be more comfortable with, which is \n. So let me compile the program again, and then run it. And let's see how it is. And see, both methods work. You can format a lot of different types of ways. You can use printf's %, or you can always use \n to insert a new line. So this wraps up how to format in Java. There are a lot of other features the printf method has, and I hope you take the time to explore them. Hi, it's me, Sheth again. I just quickly want to review the concepts we've gone over today. I know we've gone through a lot of things, so let's begin with the most important, switch statements. Switch statements understand when you can use switch statements and when you can't. Switch statements, they don't work if you want to compare multiple variables. Also, they won't work if you want to compare a range that your number is between. For both cases, you'd have to end up using an if statement. Also, in addition to that, I taught you how to accept only integers from the user, so if they enter a string or a double or any other data type, how you can terminate the program. On top of that, I discussed how to target specific characters in a string or specific digits in a number. One way of doing that is through dividing by a multiple of 10 using mod, or if you have a string, then you can use the char@. method. Finally, I went over how to format variables to only output 2 decimals. So I encourage you to look more into formatting decimals or just formatting the printf method in general, because there are a lot of different types of formatting you can do, from formatting %signs to adding leading spaces. I encourage you to test yourself on how well you understand switch statements and the other concepts I went over today. I know the 2014 spring exam number 5 has a good problem about switch statements, as well as the 2013 fall exam number 5. They both are good questions that test you on how well you understand switch statements. So with that, I'm Sheth, and I'm signing off from CSE2.